Today we are going to be looking at the area of consideration. As we have seen in Chapter 1, once offer and acceptance have been established, it is then necessary to demonstrate the presence of consideration as well as an intention on the part of the parties to create legal relations, if there is to be a binding contract between them. So the first question we have to ask is, what is consideration? Consideration is something of value that each party gives the other in return for their respective promises. People normally enter into a contract in order to receive something from the other party, and the something, whatever it is referred to as consideration. Without consideration, a contract is not binding. Let us imagine that X wins the lottery and immediately promises to give Y 10,000 euros. 2 weeks later, Y asks X for the money, and X says no, saying that he has changed his mind. Can Y sue X for the 10,000 euros? No, because Y has offered X nothing in return for the money. He has offered him no consideration, and as a result, there is no binding agreement between them. In legal terms, X is said to have made Y a bare promise that is not enforceable. Consideration has been described as the quid pro quo or price tag on the promise. The consideration that each party gives the other can be financial, but it can also be anything else as long as it has a value. It can be a promise to do something or even a promise not to do something. There are a number of rules that define whether the consideration offered by the parties is sufficient so as to allow the formation of a valid contract. The first rule is that the consideration offered by the parties need not be adequate, but it must be sufficient. When looking to see whether the consideration offered by the parties is good consideration, the courts do not believe it to be their role to inquire into whether the consideration offered by the parties is adequate. Thus, if X sells his car to Y for 1,000 euros and the car is in fact worth 10,000 euros, X cannot subsequently claim that the sales contract between them is not binding because the consideration offered by Y was not adequate or enough. The common law courts do not consider it their place to ensure that X gets a good deal from Y. He gets what he asked for, and that is sufficient. The case of Thomas and Thomas is illustrative. In this case, X agreed to rent his house to Y for £1 per year, even though the rental value of the house was worth much more than this. X later claimed that his agreement with Y was not binding because the consideration offered of £1 was not good consideration and was only a symbolic payment. In the opinion of the court, although the £1 did not reflect the market rental value of the property, it was sufficient rent to allow a contract to come into effect, and that consequently X was bound by the terms of his rental agreement with Y. The second rule is that consideration must not be something that one is already bound to do. An agreement to do what one is already bound to do is not good consideration. Thus, a promise to do what one has already a duty to do is not sufficient consideration to create a binding agreement. For example, a bus driver who promises his passengers to drive them carefully to their destination where a road is damaged cannot rely on that promise as sufficient consideration to enforce a promise by the passengers to offer him a reward for so doing, as the bus driver is already under a duty to drive his passengers safely to their destination. In England and Davidson, X offered a reward for information leading to the capture of Z, a well-known criminal. England, Y, a police officer, supplied information that led to Z being captured and later sued X for the reward money. The court held that Y had no right to receive the reward. In the opinion of the court, the consideration offered by Y, namely giving the information leading to the arrest of Z, was information that he was duty-bound to give as a result of his position of police officer, and thus could not be relied upon by Y to enforce the agreement with X. In Stilk and Merrick, who will call Y, the captain of a ship, contracted with a number of sailors to work on his boat for a long ship voyage from and back to London. In the middle of the trip, a number of the sailors on the boat deserted ship when the boat was in a foreign port. In order to ensure that the other crew members stayed on board for the rest of the voyage, Y promised the remaining sailors, including Stilk, who we will call X, extra payment if they continued to crew the ship until it arrived back in London. Once the ship returned to London, Y refused to pay the extra wages on the basis that the sailors had only promised to do what they were already contractually bound to do. X sued Y for the wages he did not receive. The court held that X had no contractual right to receive the extra money, as the consideration he offered Y in return for Y's promise to pay the extra wages was a promise to do something he was already contractually bound to do. The third rule is that past consideration is not good consideration. Past consideration involves promising to do something in return for something that has already been done by the other party. For example, X finds a lost dog called Fido and takes him in and feeds him. Later, Y, the owner of the dog, promises X €500 for having looked after Fido. Will X have a cause of action if Y does not pay him the money? The answer is no, as the consideration X offered in return for Y's promise is past consideration, i.e., he looked after Fido and fed him prior to Y making the promise to pay X €500. Consequently, Y's promise is a bare promise, as X gave him nothing in return for it, and thus is unenforceable. In Re MacArdle, a husband and his wife were living with his mother. While living in the house, the daughter-in-law carried out works on general improvements to the home. After the works were done, the mother signed a document promising the daughter-in-law payment of a sum of money after her death. After she died, the estate refused to pay the money, and the daughter-in-law sued for payment of the promised money. The court held that she could not recover the money. In the opinion of the court, the consideration the daughter-in-law offered in return for the mother's promise was past consideration, insofar as the works were completed prior to the mother's promise to pay her. Consequently, the mother's promise was a bare promise, unsupported by consideration, and thus was unenforceable. However, equity has created an exception to the common law consideration rule under the doctrine of promissory estoppel. So what is promissory estoppel? The doctrine of promissory estoppel is an exception to the rule concerning consideration, and it was developed under the law of equity. Under this doctrine, if X promises Y something and Y relies on that promise to his detriment, although he offers no consideration to X in return for the promise will nonetheless be enforceable. The basis for this doctrine was developed in a case called Hughes and the Metropolitan Railway Company Limited. In this case, a landlord gave his tenant 6 months' notice to repair the flat he was renting, saying that he would be evicted if the works were not completed. 2 months later, the landlord and the tenant began negotiations concerning the purchase of the tenant's leasehold interest by the landlord, and the tenant stopped the repair works. However, the negotiations broke down at the last moment, and at the end of the 6-month period, the landlord sought to evict the tenant on the grounds that he had not carried out the repairs to the flat. The tenant appealed the eviction to the courts, claiming that the beginning of the negotiations between the landlord and the tenant, 2 months after the service of the eviction notice, amounted to, or was the equivalent to, a promise by the landlord not to enforce the eviction order he had served on the tenant. The House of Lords agreed. For the court, the opening up of negotiations amounted to an implicit promise not to apply the eviction notice whilst the negotiations were being conducted, and that it was in reliance on this implicit promise that the tenant did not repair the flat. The decision in this case became the basis for the doctrine of promissory estoppel developed by Lord Denning in what has become known as the High Trees case. Under promissory estoppel, If X promises something to Y, even if Y pays no consideration to X in return for his promise, X may in equity be required to perform his promise. In the High Trees case, X rented a block of flats in central London from Y just before the start of World War II. However, once the war began, and as a result of enemy bombing, many of the flats were unrented. As a result, X successfully negotiated a reduction in the rent due to Y. Later, toward the end of the war, the occupancy rates of the flats improved, and Y sought to increase the rent, but X refused, saying that they now had a new agreement in place whereby X had to pay less rent. Y countered that the agreement was not binding as X had supplied no consideration to Y for the reduction in rent, and thus it was not a binding agreement. The court held that Y could increase the rent. However, the court emphasized that should Y have sought to retroactively increase the rent for the whole period during which the rent was reduced, and not just from the moment the occupancy rates improved, on the basis that Y had given X no consideration for any reduction in rent, X would have been prevented from doing so in equity under the doctrine of promissory estoppel. Thus, under the doctrine of promissory estoppel, where X makes Y a promise intending to be bound by it, and where Y reasonably relies on X's promise, then X may be bound by his promise even though Y has provided no consideration for it. Thus, if X, a well-known successful businessman and patron of the arts, promises a museum a donation of 1 million euros, and on the basis of that promise the museum bills an extension, then in the case of non-payment by X of the promised money, the museum, even in the absence of consideration, could attempt to sue X for payment of the 1 million donation under the doctrine of promissory estoppel. The museum's case would be based on the fact that X should have realized that the museum would rely on his promise, and thus X could not subsequently withdraw it. However, it is important to note that as a remedy in equity, promissory estoppel is a discretionary solution, the granting of which is dependent on the facts of each case. We hope you enjoyed this introduction to the area of consideration in common law, contract law.